Albemarle County, Virginia, 1855. Ruth was 32 years old when she delivered her 15th baby with emerald green eyes and pale blonde hair. She was an enslaved midwife on the Holloway plantation, and she had learned long ago that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. But that didn't mean she couldn't document them. The baby girl in her arms was beautiful, with features that would have been celebrated in any white family. But this child had been born to Eliza, an enslaved woman with dark skin and dark eyes. And everyone on the plantation knew who the father was, even though no one dared say his name. Colonel Richard Holloway, master of 300 acres, owner of 47 human beings, respected member of Virginia society, and serial predator of the women he enslaved. Ruth wrapped the baby carefully and handed her to Eliza, whose eyes were hollow with a pain that went beyond physical exhaustion. This was Eliza's third child. All three had the same green eyes, the same blonde hair, the same unmistakable features. All three had the same father. "She's beautiful," Ruth said softly, though the word felt like ash in her mouth. Beauty was a curse for enslaved women, it made them targets. Eliza didn't respond. She just held her baby and stared at nothing, her mind somewhere far away from this room, this plantation, this nightmare that had become her life. After Eliza fell asleep, Ruth returned to her small cabin at the edge of the slave quarters. She pulled out a tin box hidden beneath the floorboards, a box that contained her most dangerous possession. A record book. For 8 years, Ruth had been documenting every birth on the Holloway plantation. She recorded the mother's name, the date, the baby's features, and in a code only she understood, she recorded the father's identity. The pattern was undeniable. 15 Bobbies in 8 years, all born to different enslaved women, all with emerald eyes and blonde hair, all with Colonel Holloway's distinctive features. Ruth knew what this record represented. It was evidence of crimes that society refused to acknowledge, crimes that were legal under Virginia law because enslaved women had no right to refuse their masters, crimes that destroyed families and traumatized generations. But it was also dangerous. If anyone discovered what Ruth was documenting, she would be killed. Not quickly, not mercifully, but as an example to others who might dare to record truths that powerful men wanted hidden. Still, she continued, because Ruth believed that someday, somehow, this evidence would matter. That truth, once documented, could never be completely erased. She didn't know she was right, but she also didn't know how long that someday would take to arrive. Ruth had been born enslaved on a neighboring plantation. Her mother had been a midwife too, teaching Ruth the skills that would become both her profession and her purpose. When Ruth was 20, she had been sold to Colonel Holloway after his previous midwife died. At first, Ruth had been grateful. Midwives were valuable, treated somewhat better than field workers. They had a measure of respect, a degree of autonomy that other enslaved people lacked. But within months, Ruth began to notice things that troubled her deeply. Young enslaved women would disappear from the quarters at night, summoned to the main house. They would return hours later, silent and shaken. Some would cry, others would stare at nothing, their spirits broken. And 9 months later, Ruth would deliver their Bobbies with green eyes and blonde hair. The first time it happened, Ruth had been shocked. She had looked at the newborn's distinctive features, then at the mother's dark skin and eyes, and felt a chill run down her spine. But the mother had just looked at her with dead eyes and said, "Don't speak on it, it only makes it worse." Ruth had learned quickly that silence was survival. The other enslaved people knew what was happening. The house staff knew, the overseers knew, even Colonel Holloway's wife knew, though she pretended not to, blaming the enslaved women for tempting her husband rather than acknowledging his violence. Everyone knew, and everyone stayed silent. Except Ruth. Ruth kept her record book. By 1855, the Holloway plantation had become infamous in whispered conversations among enslaved people throughout the county. Women knew that being sold to Holloway meant becoming a target. Families tried desperately to keep their daughters away from him. But resistance was nearly impossible. Colonel Holloway was wealthy, connected, and protected by laws that gave him absolute power over the people he enslaved. He was also careful. He never left marks that would damage his property's value. He never acknowledged the children he fathered, and he punished anyone who spoke openly about what everyone knew. Ruth had witnessed the punishments. She had treated the wounds after whippings. She had held the hands of women who wanted to die rather than endure another night being summoned to the main house. And she had delivered baby after baby with emerald eyes, each one a living testament to crimes that would never be prosecuted. But Ruth was patient. She continued her work, delivering babies, healing the sick, and maintaining her secret record. She taught several young women to read and write in secret, preparing them to continue her work if something happened to her. And she waited. The catalyst came on a cold November morning when a new overseer arrived at the plantation. His name was James Crawford, and he was different from the others. Crawford was a poor white man from North Carolina who had served in the military before taking work as an overseer. He was hard, stern, and strict about his work, but he also had something the other overseers lacked: a conscience. Ruth first noticed it when Crawford stopped another overseer from whipping a pregnant woman who had been too slow in the fields. "She's with child," Crawford said flatly. "You want to explain to the colonel why you damaged valuable property." It was a cold calculation, but it saved the woman, and Ruth noticed. Over the following weeks, Ruth observed Crawford carefully. He enforced the work requirements, but he didn't use excessive violence. He didn't assault enslaved women, and most tellingly, he seemed uncomfortable when Colonel Holloway summoned young women to the main house. One evening, Ruth was treating a child's fever when Crawford appeared at her cabin door. "The colonel wants you to prepare a tonic for his wife," Crawford said. But his eyes swept the small cabin, taking in the herbs drying from the rafters, the careful organization of Ruth's medical supplies. "You're educated," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ruth's heart stopped. Being caught with literacy skills could mean severe punishment. "I know healing," Ruth said carefully. "My mother taught me." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "I served with colored soldiers during the Mexican War, free men who fought just as bravely as any white soldier. I've seen what your people can do when given the chance." He paused. "What's happening on this plantation with those bobbies? It's not right. I know that's a strange thing for an overseer to say, but it's true. I've only been here 2 months, but I've seen enough." Ruth studied his face, looking for deception or trap, but she saw only weariness and genuine disgust. "There's nothing I can do about it," Crawford continued. "The law protects him, society protects him, but if there was evidence, real, documented evidence, maybe someday someone could use it." He met Ruth's eyes. "You keep records, don't you? I've seen you writing, seen you hide things." Ruth's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment when her dangerous work would either end in disaster or find unexpected support. "If I did," she said slowly, "what would you do about it?" "Keep you safe while you continue," Crawford replied. "And when the time comes, if it comes, make sure that evidence reaches someone who can use it." It was a gamble. Crawford could be lying, could be testing her loyalty, could be setting a trap. But Ruth had spent 8 years documenting atrocities with no plan for what to do with that evidence. Now someone was offering to help. "I'll think about it," Ruth said. Crawford nodded. "Don't take too long. The colonel's eye has fallen on a new girl, 14 years old. It'll happen soon unless something changes." He left and Ruth sat alone in her cabin, her hands shaking. She thought about the 15 bobbies she'd delivered with emerald eyes. She thought about the mothers whose spirits had been broken. She thought about the 14-year-old girl who was about to be added to that list. And she made a decision. That night, Ruth retrieved her record book and made a new entry, but this time, she didn't just document a birth. She wrote a detailed account of the colonel's pattern of assaults, naming dates, naming victims, describing the bobbies who were living proof of his crimes. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Because Ruth understood something that would take the rest of the nation years to acknowledge: silence protected predators, documentation threatened them. And she was done being silent. 2 days later, Ruth approached Crawford while he was alone in the barn. "I have records," she said quietly. 8 years of births, 15 Bobbies with emerald eyes and blonde hair, all from enslaved mothers, all with one father. Crawford's jaw tightened. Can you prove it? I have dates, names, descriptions. I have details that could be verified by anyone who knows the families. I have a pattern that's undeniable. Why are you telling me this? Ruth looked him in the eye. Because you said someone could use this evidence someday, and because that 14-year-old girl deserves better than silence. Crawford was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, there's a Union sympathizer in Charlottesville, a lawyer who's been quietly documenting evidence of slavery's brutality. He's collecting testimonies, records, anything that might help the abolitionist cause. You want me to give him my records? I want you to survive long enough to testify yourself when this all comes crashing down. And it will come down, Ruth, maybe not this year or next, but the system can't hold. There's going to be a reckoning. Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. What do we do? We wait, Crawford said. We document everything, and when the moment comes, we act. They waited 3 months. 3 months during which Ruth continued delivering Bobbies and Crawford continued managing the plantation's operations. 3 months during which they secretly copied Ruth's records, creating duplicates that Crawford hid off the plantation. And 3 months during which Colonel Holloway continued summoning young women to the main house, unaware that his crimes were being documented in unprecedented detail. Then came the night that changed everything. February 14, 1856. Ruth was awakened by screaming, not the screaming of childbirth which she knew intimately, but something different, high-pitched, terrified, desperate. She pulled on her clothes and ran toward the sound. It was coming from the main house. Other enslaved people were emerging from their cabins, drawn by the commotion but afraid to get too close. The main house was dangerous territory at the best of times. At night it was even more so. But Ruth was a midwife. She had privileges others didn't. She could go where others couldn't. She reached the main house to find chaos. Servants were running everywhere. Mrs. Holloway was shouting, and the screaming continued from somewhere upstairs. Crawford appeared at Ruth's side. It's the Colonel, he said grimly. Something's happened. They found Colonel Holloway in his bedroom, clutching his chest, his face gray with pain. A heart attack, Ruth recognized immediately. A severe one. And standing in the corner, trembling and crying, was Sarah, the 14-year-old girl Crawford had warned Ruth about weeks earlier. Her dress was torn, her face was bruised. Ruth understood immediately what had happened. The Colonel had summoned Sarah, the assault had begun, and his heart had given out mid-attack. Get her out of here, Ruth whispered to Crawford while pretending to examine the Colonel. Crawford moved quickly, ushering Sarah out through a side door before Mrs. Holloway or the other household staff could focus on her. Ruth turned her attention to the Colonel. She went through the motions of trying to help him, but she knew it was futile. He was dying and there was nothing she could do even if she had wanted to. Within 20 minutes, Colonel Richard Holloway was dead. The plantation descended into chaos. Mrs. Holloway was hysterical. The household staff didn't know what to do. The field overseers gathered, trying to maintain order among enslaved people who sensed something momentous had happened. In the confusion, Ruth found Crawford again. They stood in the shadows near the slave quarters, watching the main house. This changes everything, Crawford said quietly. What happens now? Ruth asked. The estate will go to probate, the Colonel's brother will likely inherit, or everything will be sold, including the people. Ruth felt cold fear grip her heart. Being sold meant families being separated. It meant her records being lost. It meant Sarah and the other young women being vulnerable to new predators. We need to act now, she said, while everything is in chaos before a new master takes over. Crawford looked at her. What are you suggesting? Your contact in Charlottesville, the lawyer, can you get a message to him tonight? Tonight, Ruth, there are going to be guards everywhere. They'll be watching for runaways. Not watching very carefully, Ruth interrupted. Everyone is focused on the main house, on the Colonel's death, on what happens next. No one is paying attention to what's happening in the quarters. Crawford understood. You want to run. I want to testify. I want to get these records to someone who can use them. and I want to do it before I'm sold to another master who'll make sure I never get the chance." It was bold, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but Ruth had spent 8 years waiting for an opportunity. This was it. "I can get you to Charlottesville," Crawford said slowly. "I have a wagon I use for plantation business. If I leave tonight, people will assume I'm fetching the doctor or the lawyer or someone official to deal with the colonel's death. Then let's go." "Ruth, if you're caught, they'll kill you, not sell you." "Kill you. Running away is one thing, but running away with evidence that could expose wealthy men, that's unforgivable." "I know," Ruth said, "but staying quiet is killing me anyway, just slower." She returned to her cabin and retrieved her tin box. 8 years of records, 15 bobbies with emerald eyes, dozens of assaults documented in careful, coded detail. She also grabbed something else, a list of names, every enslaved woman on the Holloway plantation who had been assaulted by the colonel. 32 names, some were still on the plantation. Others had been sold away, their fates unknown. If Ruth was going to risk her life for this testimony, she was going to make sure all their voices were heard. Crawford's wagon was ready within an hour. He had loaded it with legitimate plantation business as cover documents for the lawyer, personal effects of the colonels to be inventoried, and hidden beneath it all was Ruth. They left the plantation at midnight, the wagon creaking slowly down the dark road toward Charlottesville. Ruth lay in the hidden compartment Crawford had created, her tin box clutched to her chest, listening to the wagon wheels turn. Every sound made her jump. Every time the wagon stopped, she thought they'd been caught. But Crawford was calm, confident. He knew how to play the role of the dutiful overseer handling his master's business. They reached Charlottesville as dawn broke. Crawford drove the wagon to a modest house on the edge of town and knocked on the door. A white man in his 50s answered, his expression wary until he saw Crawford. "James," the man said, "what are you doing here?" "Daniel, I need your help, and I need you not to ask too many questions until we're inside." Daniel looked past Crawford to the wagon, then back at his face. Something in Crawford's expression made him nod. "Come in quickly." Once inside, Crawford helped Ruth out of her hiding place. Daniel's eyes widened when he saw her. "James, what have you done?" "What needed to be done?" Crawford replied. He turned to Ruth. "This is Daniel Hartwell, he's the lawyer I told you about. Daniel, this is Ruth, she has evidence you need to see." Ruth was shaking from cold, fear, and exhaustion, but she managed to hold out her tin box. 8 years of records," she said, her voice hoarse. 15 bobbies with green eyes and blonde hair, all born to enslaved women, all fathered by Colonel Richard Holloway. Dates, names, details, everything documented. Daniel took the box with trembling hands. He opened it and began reading Ruth's careful entries. His face went pale. "My God," he whispered, this is evidence of systematic assault. This could be used to." He stopped, looking up at Ruth. "Do you understand what you've done, what this could mean?" "I understand. I documented the truth," Ruth said. "What happens with that truth is up to you." Daniel sat down heavily. "Colonel Holloway died last night." Crawford nodded. "Heart attack. His estate is in chaos. That's why we came now. Before anyone realizes Ruth is gone. They'll come looking for her, a runaway slave. With this information, they'll hunt her to the ends of the earth." "I know," Ruth said, "but I'm not running to hide, I'm running to testify. You said you've been collecting evidence about slavery's brutality. This is evidence, use it." Daniel looked at the records again. "These bobbies, they're still on the plantation. Most of them, the oldest is 7 years old, the youngest is 3 months. Living proof," Daniel murmured. "Not just documents but human beings who carry the evidence in their very appearance." He stood suddenly. "We need to move fast. Get Ruth somewhere safe while I figure out what to do with this information. James, you need to get back to the plantation before anyone realizes you helped her." "What about the other women?" Ruth asked. "The mothers, the girls who are still there, they need protection." "I don't know if I can provide that," Daniel said honestly. "The law doesn't protect enslaved women from their masters. That's part of what makes this so damning. These crimes aren't legally crimes at all." "Then change the law," Ruth said fiercely. "Use my records to change it." Daniel looked at her with something like awe. You're incredibly brave and incredibly naive if you think laws will change just because we have evidence of their injustice. Maybe not today, Ruth replied, but someday, and when that day comes, my records will be ready. Crawford spoke up, I need to go. Ruth, stay hidden, stay safe. Daniel, protect her. He left quickly, heading back to the plantation to maintain his cover. Ruth and Daniel sat in the lawyer's office, the tin box between them, as dawn light filled the room. What happens now? Ruth asked. Now, Daniel said slowly, I do something that could get us both killed. I send copies of your records to abolitionist newspapers in the North, to politicians who oppose slavery, to anyone who might use this evidence to challenge the system. And what happens to me? You can't stay in Virginia. We need to get you to Pennsylvania or Ohio. Somewhere the Fugitive Slave Act will be harder to enforce, somewhere you might have a chance. I'm not leaving until I know those women and children are safe. Daniel sighed. Ruth, you can't save them from here, the law. The law is wrong? Ruth's voice rose. 15 children have been born from assault and the law says that's perfectly fine because their mothers are property. 32 women have been traumatized and the law says they have no right to refuse. The law is the problem, Mr. Hartwell, and hiding won't change it. Daniel studied her for a long moment. What do you want to do? I want to testify publicly. I want to tell the truth about what happened on that plantation. I want those Bobbies' existence to mean something. I want justice. There is no justice for enslaved people in Virginia courts. Then we find another court, the court of public opinion, the court of Northern voters, the court of history. Somewhere, somehow, the truth has to matter. Daniel was quiet, thinking. Finally, he said, there's an abolitionist conference in Philadelphia next month. Frederick Douglass will be there, Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison, people who have platforms who can amplify your story, if you're willing to testify there. I'm willing, Ruth said immediately. It will make you a target. Every slaveholder in the South will want you dead. You'll never be able to return to Virginia. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. Ruth thought about the 15 Bobbies with emerald eyes, about Sarah's torn dress and bruised face, about 32 women who had endured what should never have been endured. I've been looking over my shoulder my whole life, she said quietly. At least this way there's a purpose to it. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, March 1856. Ruth stood backstage at the Pennsylvania Hall, listening to the crowd noise filtering through the walls. 2,000 people had gathered to hear speakers at the American Anti-Slavery Society's annual conference. Most had come to hear famous abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. They had no idea they were about to hear from a fugitive enslaved woman with evidence that would shake the nation's conscience. Ruth's hands trembled as she clutched her notes. The past month had been a whirlwind. Daniel Hartwell had arranged her transport north through the Underground Railroad. She had traveled hidden in wagons, walked through freezing forests, and stayed in safe houses run by brave people who risked everything to help fugitives. And everywhere she went, Daniel had sent ahead copies of her records. Abolitionist newspapers had begun publishing excerpts. The story of the 15 Bobbies with emerald eyes had spread through anti-slavery circles like wildfire. But words on a page were one thing. Ruth's actual testimony would be something else entirely. You don't have to do this, a voice said behind her. Ruth turned to see Frederick Douglass, the famous orator and former slave. He had his own story of escape and testimony. He understood what Ruth was about to face. They'll try to destroy you, Douglass continued. Pro-slavery advocates will call you a liar. They'll say you made it all up for attention or money. They'll attack your character, your intelligence, everything about you. I know, Ruth said. And even if they believe you, it won't stop the abuse. One slaveholder's exposure doesn't change a system built on exploitation. I know that too. Douglass smiled sadly. Then why do this? Because silence protects them, Ruth replied. Because those 15 Bobbies deserve to have their stories told, because 32 women deserve to be heard, and because maybe, just maybe, the truth will make one person change their mind. One person decide slavery is wrong, one person join the fight, and that's worth it. Douglass nodded. Then go tell your truth and I'll stand with you when you do. William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist who ran the Liberator * newspaper, introduced Ruth to the crowd. "We have heard many testimonies about slavery's brutality," Garrison said, "but today you will hear something unprecedented. A woman who spent 8 years documenting systematic assault, who risked her life to bring that evidence north, who stands before you as living proof that enslaved women have been screaming the truth about slavery if only we were willing to listen." He gestured to the wings. "I present to you Ruth, formerly of the Holloway Plantation in Virginia." Ruth walked onto the stage. The crowd was mostly white, mostly wealthy, mostly people who had never experienced slavery directly. But scattered throughout were black faces, former slaves, freeborn activists, people who knew exactly what Ruth was about to describe. She began speaking. "My name is Ruth. For 32 years I was enslaved on plantations in Virginia. For 8 years I served as a midwife on the Holloway Plantation, and in those 8 years I delivered 15 bobbies who should never have been born." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Ruth continued. "These bobbies were beautiful. Emerald green eyes, pale blonde hair, features that would have been celebrated in any white family, but their mothers were enslaved women with dark skin and dark eyes, and everyone knew who the father was." Ruth pulled out her records. Even from a distance, the crowd could see the careful handwriting, the detailed entries. "Colonel Richard Holloway assaulted 32 women over the 8 years I served on his plantation. I know because I treated them afterward. I held their hands while they cried. I delivered the bobbies that resulted. And I documented every single case because I believed that someday, somehow, the truth would matter." She read from her records, dates, names, details that made the crowd gasp and murmur. Some women in the audience began crying, some men looked ill. "The law says enslaved women are property," Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger. "The law says they have no right to refuse their masters. The law says these 15 bobbies are just more property with no rights, no protection, no acknowledgement of the violence that created them." She looked out at the crowd. "But I'm here to tell you that the law is wrong. These women are human beings who were assaulted. These bobbies are human beings born from violence, and the system that allows this, that protects the Colonel Holloways of the world while silencing their victims, that system is evil." The crowd erupted. Some people stood and applauded, others shouted in agreement. A few, mostly Southern sympathizers who had come to heckle, began shouting that Ruth was lying, that she was being coached by abolitionists, that this was propaganda. But Ruth stood firm. She had expected this response. "I brought evidence," she said, raising her voice above the noise. 8 years of records, midwife notes that any doctor could verify, details about births that can be corroborated by anyone who knows the families involved. And most importantly, those 15 children still exist. They're still on the Holloway plantation or have been sold to other plantations. Anyone who doubts my testimony can go look at them, see their emerald eyes and blonde hair, see the living proof of what I'm describing." A man in the audience stood up. "Even if what you say is true, those women probably encouraged him. We all know how seductive Negro women can be." The crowd exploded in angry shouts, but before anyone else could respond, Ruth spoke. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "the youngest of those 32 women was 13 years old. The oldest was 42. Some were married to other enslaved men. Some had children already. Some begged not to be summoned to the main house. But it didn't matter, because under Virginia law we have no right to refuse, no right to say no, no right to our own bodies." She paused, letting that sink in. "You want to blame the victims? Then you're part of the problem. You're part of the reason this continues. You're part of the system that protects rapists, because acknowledging what they do would mean acknowledging that slavery is built on violence." The man sat down, his face red. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on Ruth's every word. "I'm not here asking for your pity," Ruth said. "I'm here demanding your action. I'm here saying that if this evidence, if these 15 bobbies, if 32 women's testimonies, if none of that is enough to convince you that slavery is evil, then you've chosen to be blind." She held up her records one more time. "This is the truth, documented, verified, undeniable truth. What you do with it is up to you, but you can never again claim you didn't know." Ruth left the stage to thunderous applause. But she also saw the faces of Southern sympathizers in the crowd, faces filled with rage and hatred. She had made powerful enemies today. Backstage, Frederick Douglass embraced her. That was extraordinary. You just changed minds. I could see it happening. Will it be enough? Ruth asked. I don't know, Douglas admitted, but it's more than we had yesterday. Over the next few weeks, Ruth's testimony spread across the nation. Northern newspapers published accounts of her speech. Abolitionist societies distributed copies of her records. The story of the 15 bobbies with emerald eyes became a rallying cry for the anti-slavery movement. But the backlash was equally fierce. Southern newspapers called Ruth a liar and a fraud. They claimed she had been coached by abolitionists to fabricate a sensational story. They said the bobbies couldn't possibly all be Colonel Holloway's children, that enslaved women often had multiple partners. Most viciously, they attacked Ruth's character. They called her immoral, suggested she was motivated by jealousy, and implied that any relationship she had with the colonel had been consensual. Ruth read these attacks with a mixture of anger and resignation. She had expected them, but that didn't make them hurt less. Then came the threats. Letters arrived at the Philadelphia boarding house where Ruth was staying. Some promised violence if she continued speaking. Others offered money to return to Virginia and recant her testimony. A few simply said, "We're coming for you." Daniel Hartwell urged her to go further north, to Canada, where she would be completely beyond the reach of slave catchers. But Ruth refused. Running won't change anything. They want me silent. They want the truth buried. I won't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she did something that terrified everyone around her. She agreed to testify in a legal proceeding. A group of Northern lawyers had filed a civil lawsuit against the Holloway estate on behalf of the enslaved women Ruth had documented. It was a long shot. Courts had never recognized enslaved people's right to sue their masters. But with the evidence Ruth had provided, the lawyers thought they might have a chance. The case was unprecedented. It argued that even under slavery's legal framework, assault was still assault, that masters had a duty not to damage their property through violence. It was a cynical legal argument that treated the women as property, but it was the only argument that might work in a Virginia court. The trial was set for June 1856 in Richmond. Ruth would have to return to Virginia, the state she had fled as a fugitive, and testify in open court. They'll arrest you the moment you cross the state line, Daniel warned. This is suicide. Then get me legal protection, Ruth replied. Isn't that what lawyers do? Daniel worked frantically. He arranged for federal marshals to escort Ruth to Richmond. He filed dozens of motions arguing that as a witness in a federal case, Ruth had temporary immunity from fugitive slave laws. He built a legal framework that was untested and uncertain. But it was Ruth's only chance. The journey to Richmond was tense. Ruth traveled with two federal marshals, Daniel and Frederick Douglass, who had insisted on accompanying her. They took trains through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and into Virginia. At every stop, crowds gathered. Some were supporters cheering Ruth's courage, others were hostile, shouting insults and threats. When they reached Richmond, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The trial had become a sensation. Newspapers from across the nation had sent reporters. The courtroom would be packed. The night before Ruth was scheduled to testify, Daniel came to her hotel room with grave news. "The Holloway family has offered you a deal," he said. "They'll pay you $5,000, a fortune, if you refuse to testify. They'll also guarantee your freedom legally in writing. You'd never have to worry about being returned to slavery." Ruth looked at him. "And all I have to do is stay silent?" "Yes." "And what happens to the 32 women still enslaved? What happens to the next generation of girls who will be targeted? What happens to the truth?" Daniel sighed. "I told them you'd refuse, but I had to present the offer." "I'm testifying," Ruth said. "No amount of money is worth silence." The next morning, Ruth walked into the Richmond courthouse under armed guard. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled. People stood in the aisles, more crowded outside, hoping to hear what happened. The judge, a Virginia native and slaveholder himself, looked at Ruth with barely concealed contempt. The Holloway family's lawyer stood and immediately objected. "Your Honor, this witness is a fugitive slave. She has no legal standing to testify in a Virginia court. Her presence here is itself a violation of law." Daniel stood. Your Honor, Miss Ruth has been granted temporary witness immunity by federal authorities. She is here under federal protection to provide testimony in a case involving interstate commerce and federal jurisdiction. It was a stretch, a huge legal stretch, but the judge, aware that the nation was watching, allowed the testimony to proceed. Ruth took the stand and was sworn in. Then, for 2 hours, she told her story. She referenced her records, provided dates and names, described the 15 bobbies with emerald eyes. And she did something unprecedented. She named each of the 32 women by name. She gave them voices. She made them real to the courtroom full of people who had spent their lives pretending enslaved women didn't have feelings or rights or humanity. The Holloway lawyer tried to discredit her. Isn't it true you ran away from the plantation?
Yes.
So you're a thief who stole yourself from your rightful owner. I freed myself from illegal captivity, Ruth corrected. Illegal, slavery is legal in Virginia. Legal doesn't mean right, Ruth said. Slavery is legal. Assault is legal when the victim is enslaved, but that doesn't make either one right, it just means the law is evil. The courtroom erupted, the judge demanded order, but Ruth had made her point. When the questioning finally ended, Ruth stepped down from the witness stand exhausted but unbowed. The verdict would take weeks, but Ruth had done what she came to do. She had told the truth. And the nation had listened. Richmond, Virginia, August 1856. The verdict came down on a sweltering summer afternoon. Ruth sat in the packed courtroom, surrounded by federal marshals, listening as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling. The case had dragged on for 2 months. The Holloway family's lawyers had presented character witnesses claiming Colonel Holloway was a respectable gentleman. They had brought in doctors who testified that the Bobby's features could be coincidental. They had argued that even if the colonel had fathered children with enslaved women, that was his right as their owner. But Ruth's testimony, backed by her meticulous records, had been devastating. The pattern was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge cleared his throat. In the matter of the Holloway estate civil proceedings, Ruth held her breath. This court finds that while the testimony provided by the witness Ruth is compelling and disturbing, the law is clear. Under Virginia statute, enslaved persons are property. The relationship between master and property is governed by the rights of ownership, not by moral considerations. Ruth felt her heart sink. Furthermore, the judge continued, while the court does not condone the actions described, we cannot find that said actions constitute legally actionable harm. The plaintiff has failed to establish standing under current law. He banged his gavel, case dismissed. The courtroom exploded. Abolitionists shouted in outrage. Southern sympathizers cheered. Federal marshals moved quickly to surround Ruth, protecting her from the chaos. Daniel looked at Ruth, his face gray with defeat. I'm sorry, I thought we had a chance. The law was never going to protect us, Ruth said quietly. I knew that, but now everyone else knows it too. And she was right. The dismissal of the case, despite overwhelming evidence, became a rallying cry for the abolitionist movement. Northern newspapers condemned the verdict. Speakers at anti-slavery meetings cited it as proof that the Southern legal system was corrupt. The story of the 15 bobbies with emerald eyes spread further. Artists created illustrations based on Ruth's testimony. Writers penned articles. The case became a symbol of slavery's inherent violence and the law's complicity in that violence. But for Ruth personally, the verdict meant something else. She was still in danger. The temporary immunity that had allowed her to testify expired the moment the trial ended. Legally, she was a fugitive slave who had returned to Virginia. The Holloway family, humiliated by the trial despite winning, wanted revenge. We need to get you out of Virginia tonight, Daniel said as they left the courthouse through a back entrance. I have a carriage waiting, we'll take you to Washington, then north to Pennsylvania. But as they emerged into the alley, they found it blocked. 10 men stood there, armed and dangerous. Ruth recognized 2 of them, overseers from the Holloway plantation. That's her, one said, the runaway. The federal marshals stepped forward. This woman is under federal protection, step aside. Federal protection ended when the trial did, the leader of the group said. "She's a fugitive slave in Virginia. We have every legal right to apprehend her." One of the marshals reached for his weapon, but Daniel stopped him. "Don't, they want a confrontation, they want an excuse to claim," she resisted. He turned to the men blocking their path. "Name your price, how much to let her go." "She's not for sale," the leader said. "The Holloway family wants to make an example. Can't have slaves thinking they can run away, testify in court, and get away with it." Ruth stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm not going back in chains. If you want me, you'll have to kill me right here in this alley." The standoff lasted for long, tense moments. Then a voice called out from the street. "What's happening here?" A man in a military uniform appeared at the entrance to the alley. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone used to command. His uniform marked him as an officer in the U.S. Army. The leader of the men blocking their path scowled. "This is none of your concern, Captain." "I'm making it my concern," the officer said. He walked into the alley, his hand resting on his sidearm. "I was in the courtroom today. I heard this woman's testimony, and I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by while a mob kidnaps a witness in broad daylight." "She's a fugitive slave." "She's a human being under federal protection," the captain interrupted. "And I'm a federal officer who says she's leaving this alley safely. Anyone who disagrees can take it up with my commander." The men hesitated. Taking on federal marshals was one thing, taking on a U.S. Army officer was another. The consequences could be severe. Finally, reluctantly, they stepped aside. The captain escorted Ruth, Daniel, and the marshals to a waiting carriage. As they climbed in, Ruth turned to him. "Thank you, Captain." "Sterling," he said. "Captain James Sterling, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers." "Why did you help me?" Sterling was quiet for a moment. "I served in the Mexican War. I watched men die for this country, black men and white men fighting side by side, and when I came home I watched this nation tear itself apart over slavery. I'm tired of it, Miss Ruth, tired of good people suffering because of an evil institution." He tipped his hat. "Get her out of Virginia, Mr. Hartwell, and Miss Ruth, keep telling your truth. Some of us are listening." The carriage sped away toward the Virginia border. Ruth watched Richmond disappear behind them, knowing she would never return. But her work wasn't done. In fact, it was just beginning. Over the next 4 years, Ruth became one of the most prominent voices in the abolitionist movement. She traveled throughout the North, giving speeches, sharing her records, refusing to let people forget the 15 bobbies with emerald eyes. She also did something else. She gathered more testimonies. She interviewed other fugitive enslaved women, documenting their stories of assault and abuse. Her original record book grew into volumes of evidence, all carefully preserved and copied. "You're building a historical record," Frederick Douglass told her in 1859. "Future generations will read your work and know the truth about what enslaved women endured." "If there are future generations," Ruth replied, "this nation is headed toward war." She was right. The conflict between North and South was intensifying. The doctored Scott decision had declared that black people had no rights white people were bound to respect. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry had shown that some abolitionists were willing to use violence. The election of 1860 would tear the nation apart. Ruth continued her work even as the nation hurtled toward catastrophe. She knew that war was coming, and she wanted the historical record to be clear about what was at stake. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, Southern states began seceding. By April 1861, the Civil War had begun. Ruth watched the war's early months with a mixture of hope and frustration. Lincoln said the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. The Union Army initially returned fugitive slaves to their masters. It seemed like the truth about slavery's violence would once again be buried beneath political calculations. But then something unexpected happened. Enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines by the thousands. They called it self-emancipation, freeing themselves whether the government acknowledged it or not. Union generals, overwhelmed by the influx, began declaring fugitive slaves contraband of war and refusing to return them. Ruth saw her opportunity. She traveled to Washington, D.C. and requested a meeting with anyone in the Lincoln administration who would listen. She brought her records, now numbering over 300 testimonies from formerly enslaved women. She was passed from clerk to clerk, department to department. No one wanted to deal with a black woman demanding to testify about slavery's sexual violence. Finally, she was directed to the office of a man who would change everything, Captain James Sterling. Sterling had been promoted to colonel and was now working in the War Department helping to organize the Union's strategy. When Ruth walked into his office, his face lit up with recognition. "Miss Ruth, I wondered what had become of you." "I've been documenting," Ruth said, "collecting testimonies, building evidence, and now I need someone to listen." Sterling gestured to a chair. "I'm listening." Ruth spent 3 hours telling Sterling about what she had learned since their last meeting, about the hundreds of enslaved women whose stories she had documented, about the pattern of abuse that extended across the entire South, not just one plantation. "This isn't about one bad master," Ruth said. "This is systemic, built into the structure of slavery itself, and if the Union wins this war but doesn't acknowledge that truth, we'll have failed." Sterling was quiet, absorbing what she had said. Finally, he spoke. "I can't promise the administration will listen. Lincoln is focused on military strategy and political calculations, but I can get your testimony to people who matter, congressmen who are pushing for emancipation, generals who are questioning whether the Union should be returning fugitive slaves." "I need more than that," Ruth said. "I need protection for those 15 bobbies. They're still on plantations throughout Virginia, still at risk, still being treated as property." Sterling's expression shifted to something like surprise. "You want the Union Army to rescue specific children?" "I want the Union Army to acknowledge that those children are victims, that their mothers are victims, that slavery isn't just about economics or politics, it's about systematic violence against black bodies, especially black women's bodies." Sterling shook his head. "That's not how this war is being framed." "Then the framing is wrong," Ruth said flatly, "and I'm going to keep saying that until someone with power admits it." Sterling looked at her for a long moment, then he made a decision that would change both their lives. "Come with me," he said. Washington, D.C., January 1863. Colonel James Sterling stood in the War Department holding a document that could change everything. It was Ruth's testimony, compiled and organized into a comprehensive report on the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. 300 testimonies, 15 years of research, undeniable evidence of systematic abuse. And he was about to deliver it to President Abraham Lincoln. "You realize this could get you court-martialed," his aide warned. "This isn't military intelligence, this isn't strategic planning, this is..." "This is truth," Sterling interrupted, "and truth matters even in wartime." Ruth waited in a separate room, under guard but not under arrest. She had spent the past 18 months working with Sterling to document not just the abuse itself, but its strategic implications for the war. Enslaved women were fleeing to Union lines with information about Confederate troop movements, supply routes, weapons caches. They were willing to spy to risk their lives to help the Union cause, but they were being turned away because military commanders didn't want to deal with women's issues. Ruth had argued that this was a catastrophic mistake, that enslaved women represented one of the Union's most valuable intelligence sources, that treating them as irrelevant was not just morally wrong, it was strategically foolish. Sterling had listened, and more importantly, he had acted. The meeting with Lincoln was scheduled for 2 p.m. Sterling gathered his materials and headed to the president's office, Ruth's words echoing in his mind. "Tell him the truth, all of it, no sanitizing, no softening, he needs to hear what slavery really is." President Lincoln looked exhausted when Sterling entered. The war was not going well, Union defeats had mounted, casualties were staggering. The Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln had signed just weeks earlier, was controversial even in the North. "Colonel Sterling," Lincoln said, "I'm told you have information I need to hear, though I confess I'm not sure what a Corps of Engineers officer has to tell me that my generals haven't already." "Mr. President, I'm here to talk about a weapon the Confederacy is using that we've been ignoring, and a resource the Union has been wasting." Lincoln raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Sterling laid out Ruth's research. He explained the systematic assault of enslaved women, the pattern of violence across hundreds of plantations, the children who were living evidence of those crimes. And then he explained the strategic implications. These women have information, sir. They know Confederate officers' habits, troop movements, supply chains. They're motivated to help the Union because we represent their only hope for freedom. But we've been turning them away or treating them as mere refugees rather than potential intelligence assets. Lincoln listened intently. When Sterling finished, the president was quiet for a long time. "You're asking me to acknowledge that slavery isn't just an economic system," Lincoln finally said, "that it's built on violence, specifically violence against women. I'm telling you that's the truth, sir, whether we acknowledge it or not. And this woman Ruth who compiled this research, she's here." "Yes, sir. I'd like to meet her." Sterling's heart raced. "Mr. President, she's a fugitive slave, technically even in Washington. I signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Colonel. I think I can grant one woman immunity to speak truth in my office." Ruth was brought to the president's office under heavy guard. She wore a simple dress, her hair covered by a modest scarf, but her eyes were fierce and unafraid. Lincoln stood when she entered, a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. "Miss Ruth," he said, "Colonel Sterling has told me about your work. I'd like to hear it from you directly." Ruth had met powerful men before. She had testified in courts, spoken at conferences, faced hostile questioners. But standing before the President of the United States, she felt the weight of this moment. "Mr. President," she began, "I spent 8 years documenting crimes that the law refused to recognize. I delivered 15 bobbies who were evidence of systematic assault. I held the hands of 32 women who were traumatized by violence that society pretended didn't exist. And I've spent the last 7 years collecting hundreds more testimonies just like them." She pulled out her original tin box, worn now from years of travel and use. "These records represent the truth about slavery that most white Americans don't want to face. That enslaved women are assaulted regularly, systematically, as part of the institution itself. That the children born from that violence are denied their fathers' names, their inheritance, their very humanity. That the system survives by silencing victims and protecting perpetrators." Lincoln's face was grave. "What would you have me do with this information?" "Acknowledge it," Ruth said simply. "In your speeches, your policies, your vision for what comes after this war, don't let people pretend slavery was just about economics or states' rights. Make them face what it really was: systematic violence against black bodies, especially black women's bodies." "And the children?" Lincoln asked. "These 15 bobbies you documented, where are they now?" "Some are still enslaved, some have been sold away, some may have died, I don't know. But I know their existence proved something that needed proving, that enslaved women were telling the truth about being assaulted and that society was choosing not to believe them." Lincoln walked to his window, looking out at Washington. "If I acknowledge what you're asking me to acknowledge, it will make Reconstruction even more complicated. It will require confronting not just political and economic questions but moral ones that this nation has never been willing to face." "Yes, sir," Ruth said, "but silence hasn't made anything better. It's only protected the guilty and abandoned the innocent." Lincoln turned back to her. "Colonel Sterling suggested that enslaved women could be valuable intelligence sources. What do you think about that?" Ruth hesitated. She had complicated feelings about using women's trauma for military purposes, but she also understood strategy. "I think enslaved women have been surviving and resisting their entire lives," she said. "They know how to gather information, how to pass messages, how to work together in secret. If the Union Army actually protected them instead of turning them away, they would help, not because of strategy but because freedom is worth fighting for." Lincoln nodded slowly. "I'll need to think about this, but Miss Ruth, I want you to know something. Your testimony, your records, they matter. They will matter to history, whether this nation is ready to face that truth now or not." The meeting ended. Ruth was escorted back to her guarded room, but something had changed. The President of the United States had listened, had acknowledged the truth, had promised it would matter to history. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Over the next 2 years, as the Civil War raged, Sterling created a covert intelligence network built on Ruth's insights. Enslaved women who fled to Union lines were recruited as spies and scouts. They provided information that helped Union victories. They rescued other enslaved people. They became agents of their own liberation. Ruth continued documenting testimonies, but now with a new purpose: preserving evidence for the trials that would come after the war. War crimes tribunals, reconstruction policies, legal reforms. And she never forgot about the 15 bobbies with emerald eyes. In 1865, as the war ended, Sterling led a Union detachment into Virginia with a specific mission: find and protect those 15 children, now ranging in age from 7 to 13. It took months. Some had been sold away and were untraceable. Others had died: disease, malnutrition, violence. But Sterling's unit found 9 of them. 9 children with emerald eyes and blonde hair who had lived their entire lives as enslaved property despite carrying the features of their white fathers. They were brought to Washington, where Ruth met them for the first time. She had delivered some of them as bobbies. She remembered their mothers, and now she could finally give them something they'd never had: acknowledgement. "Your existence was never a shame," Ruth told them. "You were born from violence, yes, but you survived. You're here, and you're proof that enslaved women were telling the truth all along." The children's stories became part of Ruth's expanding archive, evidence for the historical record, testimony for future generations. In 1866, Ruth published a book, 15 Bobbies, a record of violence and survival **. It contained her original records, updated testimonies from the mothers who had survived, and interviews with the 9 children who had been found. The book was controversial. Many people, even in the North, found it too graphic, too uncomfortable. But it sold widely and became required reading for activists pushing for women's rights, racial justice, and legal reforms. Ruth was 42 years old when the book was published. She had spent 14 years documenting, testifying, fighting for the truth to be heard. And finally, people were listening. The Reconstruction era brought both hope and disappointment. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, ending slavery and establishing citizenship and voting rights for black men. But sexual assault of black women continued, now without even the legal framework of slavery to constrain it. The violence adapted, survived, continued. Ruth documented that too. She spent the rest of her life collecting testimonies, preserving evidence, insisting that the truth be recorded even when justice was denied. In 1890, at age 66, Ruth gave her final public speech at a women's rights convention. She stood before an audience that included both black and white women, formerly enslaved and freeborn, all fighting for justice. "I spent my life documenting the truth about slavery's violence," Ruth said. "I delivered 15 bobbies who were evidence of systematic assault. I collected hundreds of testimonies from women who survived what should never have been survived. And I learned something important: documentation matters. When I started keeping records 40 years ago, I didn't know if anyone would ever read them. I didn't know if the truth would matter. But I kept documenting because I believed that someday someone would care, that the evidence would be needed, that the victims deserved to have their voices preserved." And I was right. Those records helped end slavery. They helped convict war criminals. They helped establish legal precedents. They helped validate what black women had been saying all along: that we are human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and protection under the law. She held up her original tin box, battered now from decades of use. "This is my legacy, not the tin itself, but what it represents: the commitment to truth, even when truth is dangerous. The refusal to stay silent, even when silence would be safer. The belief that victims deserve to be heard, even when society doesn't want to listen. I'm old now. I won't live to see the full impact of this work, but I know it will continue, because truth once documented cannot be erased, and voices once raised echo through history." Ruth died in 1894 at age 70. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, formerly enslaved women whose testimonies she had preserved, activists she had inspired, historians who had used her records. Frederick Douglass, himself now elderly, gave the eulogy. "Ruth taught us that documentation is resistance, that preserving truth is revolutionary, that refusing to let victims be forgotten is justice, even when courts fail to provide it." Her records were donated to the Library of Congress, where they remain today. Historians have used them to understand slavery's violence. Activists have cited them in arguments for reparations and justice. Teachers have used them to ensure that sanitized versions of history don't erase the truth. The 15 Bobbies with emerald eyes, or rather, the 9 who survived, lived their lives knowing that their existence had meaning, that they were more than the violence that created them, that they were evidence of truth. One of them, a woman named Grace, became a teacher. She spent her life educating freed Black children, passing on Ruth's lesson that documentation and truth-telling are forms of resistance. Another, a man named Samuel, became a lawyer. He used Ruth's records as precedent in cases seeking justice for assault victims. The legacy continued. Ruth's work inspired generations of activists, historians, and truth-tellers. Her commitment to documentation became a model for how to preserve evidence of injustice even when justice itself is denied. Today, Ruth's tin box sits in the Library of Congress archives. Inside are pages yellowed with age, filled with careful handwriting documenting births, assaults, and testimonies from over 150 years ago. But those pages represent something timeless, the power of one woman who refused to be silenced, who documented truth when society wanted lies, who preserved voices when powerful people wanted them erased. The 15 Bobbies with emerald eyes were born from violence, but their existence became evidence. And that evidence, carefully preserved by a midwife who believed truth mattered, helped change history. The end. Author's note, *, this story is inspired by the historical reality of widespread sexual assault of enslaved women, though Ruth and the specific details are fictionalized. The practice of enslaved women being assaulted by their masters was systematic and widespread, and many children were born from these encounters. These children, despite often having obvious physical features from their white fathers, were treated as property with no legal recognition of their paternity. Women like Ruth, who documented these truths and fought for them to be acknowledged, deserve to be remembered and honored.